It might be odd to make a video talking about language use in 2001: A Space Odyssey, because you might think there'd be very little to discuss. An overwhelming majority of this movie has no dialogue. That was not originally the case with the screenplay, which director Stanley Kubrick co-wrote with science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke. Clarke wrote the short story upon which some of the movie was based, as well as the book 2001 in tandem with the film. Clarke was a brilliant scientist and prolific novelist, but his approach to storytelling was quite different from Kubrick's. Clarke was very much a man of words and ideas, which he lays out as clearly and explicitly as possible. You can see this in the screenplay, where there is page after page of exposition, including a voiceover that explains what's happening at every turn. All of this Kubrick cut from the final version, and thankfully so. If you want to see an example of a sci-fi masterpiece ruined by voiceover, just try and watch the narrated version of Blade Runner without cringing.
They don't advertise for killers in a newspaper. That was my profession. Ex-cop, ex-Blade Runner, ex-killer.
Kubrick, by contrast, wanted to tell a story that was beyond words, to express some deeper truth about humanity and its place in the cosmos, which could not be adequately described verbally, but which he believed could be told through the visual medium of film. He ultimately whittled away most of the dialogue and all of the narration for the final version of 2001. In a 1968 interview, Kubrick was asked to explain 2001 and answered, "It's not a message that I ever intend to convey in words. 2001 is a nonverbal experience. I tried to create a visual experience, one that bypasses verbalized pigeonholing and directly penetrates the subconscious." A big theme of this movie is the incomprehensible nature of the universe, and to explain what you see on the screen is to lessen the enigma. But this movie is the story of human evolution, and you can't extricate language from that. Where there are humans, there is language. This video explores the pragmatic aspect of language, which includes things like nonverbal communication and vocal inflection. Both of these elements do indeed directly penetrate the subconscious, because we process information from them without usually being aware of it. So let's take a look at the greatest science fiction movie ever made and see what it says, or doesn't say, about human language and what language it uses to do so. Spoilers ahead for 2001: A Space Odyssey, and if you haven't seen it, for the love of aliens, pause this video and go watch it, at least 5 times. Nonverbal communication deals with how we utilize our bodies to communicate, often subconsciously, and encompasses a wide range of behaviors, including gestures.
You want 3 Paul McCartney CDs.
Facial expressions, eye contact, posture, and even personal space.
Maybe I'll try and catch up with you.
If you Google nonverbal communication chart, you will find 100 versions of this pie chart. It shows that the meaning of our spoken words totals only 7% of our overall communication. 55% is actually our nonverbal communication, while 38% is what's called prosody. Now, the prevalence of this chart all over the internet is a little misleading because it comes from only 2 studies conducted by the same team of researchers in 1967. The researchers themselves point out that these results are heavily dependent on the context of the social situation. You can change this situation and this no longer applies. For example, none of my nonverbal language is part of what I'm communicating to you right now, because you can't see me. Nonetheless, this chart reveals the significant point that much of what we communicate is done not through our words, but our prosody and our nonverbal cues. 2001: A Space Odyssey came out in 1968, only a year after these studies were published, and I wouldn't be surprised if Kubrick was aware of them and similar data as he researched, filmed, and edited this mostly wordless movie. Considering the nonverbal aspect of language, the ancestral hominids featured in the Dawn of Man sequence are being quite communicative. The actors in the ape suits are mimes who are experts at conveying thought through gesture. Here we see the gamut of primal emotions that we still experience today. Anger, fear, loneliness, awe, perhaps even love. This sequence is intentionally wordless, of course, because it takes place before the advent of spoken language. But it's interesting and perhaps deliberately ironic that these creatures who don't yet have language are way more expressive than the Homo sapiens we'll meet later in the movie. Despite having no words, through gesture, posture, and vocalizations, we can comprehend the drama that unfolds. The primates are starving and in constant fear of being preyed upon. They need access to the watering hole and are denied by a rival tribe. But then they encounter a strange object which stimulates their cognitive abilities. As a result, they find a solution to their problem: tool use, specifically weaponry. Possibly the first step towards language as we know it today began with a unique adaptation of our hominin ancestors, one which separates us from other great apes: walking upright, or bipedalism. Bipedalism freed our hands from the responsibility of locomotion, which meant we could put them to other uses. While we don't exactly know yet the steps which resulted in the invention of language, most theories hold that the vocal component came later, after the gestural nonverbal aspect. Our hands are critical for our language, and freeing them for communication by becoming bipeds may have been the first step towards language. Bipedalism and advanced tool use are distinguishing characteristics of our genus Homo, or human. In 2001, these two characteristics are the result of contact with the monolith and symbolize the birth of our species. Before the encounter with the monolith, the apes act more like chimps. They stand close to the ground, crouching and hopping, but never walking. After the encounter, however, these hominids are now on the path to becoming Homo sapiens. The watering hole is now theirs for the taking, their first step towards global domination. And as these creatures utilize their new abilities by taking back the watering hole, we already see them begin to walk upright and brandish their weapons, in stark contrast to the opposing tribe that has not undergone a similar transformation. It's the entire history of the spread of Homo sapiens across the earth demonstrated for us in a beautiful sequence without a single word of exposition. In this next section of 2001, we finally encounter spoken dialogue. The longest conversations in this movie occur here, and yet, once again, the meaning of the spoken words scarcely convey any real information. Far more is communicated through the pragmatic usage of language here. What do I mean by that? Well, nonverbal communication and prosody are just a part of what's known as pragmatic language or pragmatics. Pragmatics is the functional use of language. It's not the meaning of the words in the sentences we use, but how we use those utterances to achieve our ends. Since language is fundamentally a social tool, the first and foremost way in which we utilize it is to connect with others. Developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky and others emphasize that the socio-pragmatic aspect of language underlies all other aspects of language. Language structures and meanings are all rooted in the social need to connect. Vygotsky even argued that our motivation for social engagement is the foundation for cognitive abilities. Language is the basis for thought, in other words, and language is a social phenomenon. The reason human babies are instinctively driven to learn language is so they can interact with their parent or caregiver. The mother-child relationship is critical for our survival since human newborns are more helpless than those of other animals. Using language functionally or pragmatically is a skill we learn and employ throughout our lifetime. But a surprisingly small percentage of our speech actually involves the direct exchange of information. Rarely do we state what we mean. We spend a lot more time indirectly conveying what we want to say.
So me think, why waste time? Say lot word when few word do trick.
Kevin, I appreciate what you're trying to do.
Thank.
Here, we have a word code, the same way we have a dress code. Sometimes words, need use, but need for talk.
But save time. More success.
Does it save time though? Because we've been here for about an hour.
For one, we have a lot of social customs and linguistic rituals that we engage in, also known as small talk. When we meet someone, we say, "How are you?" even though we're not really asking how they are most of the time. It's just a greeting. That's why it's awkward for the response to contain a truthful statement about how the person is actually doing. Ritualistic utterances like greetings don't convey any meaningful information, but they serve to establish a social connection between individuals.
Nice to see you
Hey,
again.
Wood, what a wonderful surprise to meet you here.
You're looking wonderful.
Thank you.
This is a big function of language, to establish who's a friend and who isn't. Whom do we trust, and with whom should we be on our guard? That's why most of the language in this section of 2001 has people talking a lot, but saying very little. The dialogue isn't used to drive the plot forward or explain what's going on. It's just showing people being people using language in the 21st century. When Heywood Floyd pauses to make a call to his family, the plot grinds to a halt while we watch him try to connect meaningfully with his loved ones, and I would argue the result is mostly ineffectual.
Then I'll try to telephone again tomorrow. Now, will you tell her that?
Then he's ambushed by a group of Russian scientists who want to find out why he's there and what mysterious thing is happening on the lunar base where he's headed. But social circumstances dictate that they can't just directly ask him. This is essentially the same social drama we witnessed in the Dawn of Man sequence. But instead of two tribes warring outright, we have the Cold War between the US and Russia. Instead of a watering hole, it's information that's the objective. And instead of animal bones, they vie for it with pleasant conversation. We witness the pragmatic use of language here as the scientists indirectly attempt to interrogate him. An incident is mentioned where a Russian ship was denied an emergency landing at the base. An indirect threat is even made.
So I'm afraid there's going to be a bit of a row about it. Denying the men permission to land is a direct violation of the IAS Convention.
Floyd deflects this by asking after the safety of the crew.
Will the crew get back all right?
Yes, fortunately they did.
Oh, I'm glad about that.
His tone then indicates that he feels the topic is finished. Notice the body language here, too. The Russian scientists have grave faces and their bodies are pointed towards Floyd, showing they're serious about wanting to know what he knows, while Floyd offers a calm posture and relaxed smile. His legs are crossed, though, forming a sort of barrier. When Floyd doesn't give an answer, the Russian scientist is then forced to ask directly.
At the risk of pressing you on a point you seem reticent to discuss, may I ask you a straightforward question?
Floyd again denies them the information they want.
Sorry, Dr. Smyslov, but I'm really not at liberty to discuss this.
Even this phrase is pragmatically indirect in its delivery. The empty apology of "I'm sorry," even though he's not really sorry, indicating it's not his choice or decision. There's an uncomfortable silence, which is finally broken by the group abruptly lapsing back into small talk again, so Floyd can depart.
Oh, I really must be going.
Well, I hope that you and your wife can come to the IAC conference in June.
Well, we're going to try. I hope we can make it.
He can't abruptly just get up and walk away without first going through this ritual. Kubrick is showing us what he feels we've become in the several million millennia following the dawn of man's section, a species that is much less transparent when compared to our ancestors. In this age, indirectness, deceit, misinformation, and fake news abound. It's a pretty pessimistic view of humanity in the near future. We may be more civilized, but we're still as divided as we were millions of years ago. We now just resort to subterfuge to foil one another. In the next scene, we learn that Floyd purposefully demurred with the Russian scientists in order for them to buy into the lie being spread about what's happening on the moon, and he emphasizes that the true discovery of the second monolith on the lunar surface must be kept from the public. He provides only vague answers and assurances regarding concerns about the necessity for the secrecy of the discovery. And it's this secrecy which ultimately leads Hal, in the next section of the movie, to malfunction and attempt to kill the entire crew of the ship, which is incidentally named Discovery. The film's next section has three principal characters: the astronauts Dave Bowman and Frank Poole, and the artificial intelligence HAL 9000. HAL is the culmination of man's technological ingenuity, a journey that began with Moonwatcher learning how to manipulate a bone. I mentioned earlier that another important element of our pragmatic language is our prosody, the intonation, rate, and stress which accompany our words. The same set of words can have radically different connotations depending on what sort of prosody delivers them.
I'm kidding. It is Sarcasm 101. Be more gullible. Take any seat you want.
Thanks.
Except that one. I'm kidding. Sit down.
It's really hard to tell.
Thank you.
I think the most disturbing thing about Hal is his failure to adequately employ pragmatic language. He lacks most nonverbal cues, such as facial expressions and gestures, though he does have eye contact. But the problem is, Hal's eye contact is unnerving. Kubrick could have made him just a disembodied voice, but the creative choice to give him one red, unblinking eye that is watching you the whole time is really creepy. Eye contact is yet another facet of pragmatic language. Each culture has its own unspoken instructions on how to make and break eye contact during conversation. It's usually a delicate balance where either too much or too little can elicit discomfort. When you meet someone in the US, you're supposed to smile, make eye contact, and shake hands. In Japan, on the other hand, you're supposed to bow and avoid eye contact or appear impolite or aggressive. In either culture, though, a person who just stares at you without ever blinking is going to make you want to end the conversation quickly and not give out your phone number. Hal appears to have been programmed with some aspects of pragmatic language.
Well, he acts like he has genuine emotions. Of course, he's programmed that way to make it easier for us to talk to him.
For example, he tells Poole happy birthday, and he compliments Bowman's artwork.
Happy birthday, Frank. That's a very nice rendering, Dave. I think you've improved a great deal.
But he does this with the same intonation that he uses to mutiny against the crew and then later plead for his life.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that. Without your space helmet, Dave, we're going to find that rather difficult. I know everything hasn't been quite right with me. Stop, Dave.
The tone of his voice is instantly recognizable and memorable, with its strange, soft monotone, devoid of an ounce of feeling. As a result, it's nearly impossible to get a read on him, so we're left in the dark regarding his motives or his true feelings and beliefs. Hal's prosody does noticeably change at one point, and that's at the conclusion of this section when Bowman is inside his brain, effectively killing him. It's the iconic scene where Hal begins to sing Daisy Bell. As Bowman methodically disconnects him, Hal's pitch gets progressively lower and his rate progressively slower until his voice finally devolves into a sound that is no longer recognizable as a voice. This process parallels what must be occurring with Hal's cognitive abilities. And so in this sense, through his prosody, we actually hear him losing his mind. It feels like an artificially induced and sped up dementia, actually. His voice doesn't abruptly cease. It gradually declines and fades.
I'm afraid, Dave.
On top of that, as he slowly malfunctions, he regresses to an essentially childlike state where he has lost the episodic memories of his life, much like a patient with Alzheimer's. He starts repeating what he said when he first came online, and that's why he's singing the song Daisy.
My instructor was Mr. Langley, and he taught me to sing a song.
And we even see compassion from Bowman as he encourages Hal to keep singing to occupy himself as he dies.
Yes, I'd like to hear it, Hal. Sing it for me.
It's the one real heartbreaking scene in this movie. What I find unusual concerning pragmatic language in this section is that the human crew appear almost as equally dispassionate as Hal. They never smile, joke, employ sarcasm, small talk, or gossip. Poole watches his family wish him a happy birthday with an absolutely flat affect, where we would expect, instead, some sort of emotional reaction. Even when the pair realize that Hal is malfunctioning and decide to shut him down, they show little fear or emotion. I mean, this is as angry as Bowman ever gets towards Hal, who's just tried to kill everyone on board and won't let Bowman back into the ship.
Hal, I won't argue with you anymore.
I'm curious as to your thoughts on this creative decision. Kubrick's style has been characterized as somewhat cold or distant, but I would argue that in other films we see lots of emotion from characters.
I'm cured! Praise God! You didn't convince me! Let me see your real war face!
What the performances of Bowman and Poole remind me of, actually, is something like autism spectrum disorder, which I'm sure you've heard of. Part of the autism diagnosis involves a social communication deficit of some kind. In other words, a pragmatic language disorder. People on the spectrum can present with various characteristics and levels of severity, but some characteristics include things like a monotone pitch, a flat affect, and a lack of use or understanding of prosody, nonverbal communication, social rituals, in short, anything that falls under the broad term pragmatic language. As a result, it's often difficult for them to communicate their feelings or for their communication partners to comprehend their meaning. It's not unlike the difficulty we have reading Hal or the Discovery crew. One last thing I'd like to mention regarding this section about communication is when Bowman and Poole try to get out of Hal's earshot by going into the EVA pod, but Hal reads their lips to discover they're plotting to disconnect him. What a great scene that conveys so much with so little. It shows the humans again resorting to subterfuge, but their AI creation is more clever than they are. More importantly, it shows what we've been talking about, that a good chunk of our communication is nonverbal, that it can have little to do with hearing actual words. It's not a message I ever intend to convey in words, said Kubrick. In 2001, you don't need to hear the words to get the message. Cinema is capable of things words can never express, and every scene in this movie in some way encapsulates that philosophy. Kubrick ends 2001 as he began it, with a nonverbal sequence featuring another encounter with the monolith and subsequent human transformation. In terms of nonverbal language, there are two important things to note here. The first is Bowman's face. By giving us this close-up, without a word, we nonetheless intuit some measure of what Bowman has just experienced. He looks utterly overwhelmed and awestruck. Again, any attempt to try and convey this experience through words would fall short or fail to adequately convey the mystical element. Facial expressions are a deep-seated ancient part of our communication that no doubt predates our verbal language. Recognizing faces and facial expressions was of critical importance in both ancient and modern times for members of a social group of any size. Creatures living in tribes need to recognize friends from foes. We even have specialized regions in our brain responsible for recognizing faces, which is why we can instantly discriminate among the millions of faces we see throughout our lifetime. There's an interesting disorder known as prosopagnosia, caused by damage to those brain regions responsible for facial recognition, and the result is an inability to recognize even the faces of our loved ones. People with this disorder can still recognize familiar people, however, once they hear their voice or even feel them. It's not technically a problem with their vision, but rather the brain's ability to process that visual information. In the description, there's a link to an article on prosopagnosia if you're interested in reading more about it. Bowman eventually comes to grips with his new reality. His life seems to pass or enter into a timeless existence where the many stages of his life occur simultaneously. And in the end, all his dying self can do is raise a finger towards the monolith before him. He is either pointing to it or trying to touch it. In either case, he is directing our attention to it. Pointing is an interesting human adaptation that is surprisingly important to our linguistic development. Our hands are critical for our language, and as mentioned in the Dawn of Man sequence, freeing them for communication by becoming bipeds may have been the first step towards language. A child can learn to sign before they can speak. Hands are very expressive, and we can do a lot with them. We are using them constantly for expression, and of course, sign language takes this to a whole new level. The hands, face, and vocal tract are all very closely connected. In the brain, the regions responsible for both receiving sensory input from and planning the movements for these body parts are all right next to each other. And they take up over half the brain space designated for these purposes for our entire body. This rather weird drawing is called a homunculus, or little man, and attempts to illustrate how much of our brain is devoted to moving the different parts of the body. Body parts that require more cerebral real estate to move are represented as being larger than others. Our feet, for example, don't require as much motor control as our tongues. These are the parts of our body responsible for our language, showing both how important our language is for our survival and also how complex the linguistic responsibility is to execute. A child will on average learn their first word by the end of their first year of life, but before that occurs, they first have to learn a critical skill, which is the foundation for their later language acquisition. That skill is pointing. Before a child can speak, they must learn to point. It becomes easy for child and caregiver to focus on the same object, which the caregiver will name. The child learns to imitate this sound for this object, and thus verbal language begins. A routine is established where the child can point to any object and then look at their caregiver requesting the word for that object. And that's how we learn words initially. By using this very basic, very primitive signal to direct our attention to the monolith, a signal that would have been understood even by our ancient ancestors, Kubrick harkens back to the original encounter between humanity and the monolith, where reaching out and touching it were the means of connection. Just as the primates were transformed by their first contact, so too is Bowman, and through him, all of humanity. Whereas Kubrick may have shown us a pessimistic view of humanity up to this point, 2001 actually ends optimistically. Perhaps we will have the opportunity to transform again into something more pure, innocent, and radiant. With the birth of the Star Child, the story of humanity concludes, and so does the film. Also, I just noticed that the Star Child is using the sign for more, so maybe that's Kubrick telling us to expect a sequel. But I could be reading a little too deeply into that there. Thanks for watching, guys. By the way, the first video I made for this channel was on the movie Prometheus, and when I was doing this video, I was struck by just how much that movie steals from this one. In both, aliens are responsible for engineering humans a long time ago, and humans discover this in the near future, and take a voyage to find our creators in a ship where the humans are put into cryogenic stasis, which is run by an artificial intelligence that we've created, which ultimately decides to try and destroy us, even though we finally manage to reach the aliens, where our encounter with them is totally unexplained and baffling. What do you think? I mean, I know 2001 is an influential movie, but does Prometheus go a little too far in its borrowing? Let me know in the comments.